In this video, I'm going to show you how a therapist might treat anxiety so that you can learn how to become your own therapist. So, come take a seat in my office. Now, the first thing a therapist might do to treat someone who says they have anxiety is to have them sit down and then to actually assess them to see if, in fact, they do have anxiety or if it's fear or panic. You see, before we even get into the treatment bit, we want to make sure that what they say is anxiety is in fact anxiety. Because you could throw all the therapy you want at something, but if it's not for the right thing, the therapy is probably not going to work. So, coming back to you, in order for you to be your own therapist in terms of anxiety, let's give you a couple of questions that could be asked to help tease out whether it's anxiety or fear and panic. So, what do you usually feel anxious about and how often do you experience that anxiety? You see, what I'm trying to understand here is if they're fearful of one specific thing or if there's a bit more of a generalized anxiety. If it is probably one thing, it might be a bit more fear-based than anxiety-based, because fear is a normal human response that helps mobilize you against some sort of threat. Furthermore, asking what they're usually anxious about also helps me tease out whether the anxiety is present-focused or future-focused. If it's present-focused, it's probably fear, because fear is a present moment mobilization of your resources to help you cope with some sort of threat. So it is usually in the here and now. Whereas anxiety is about what's going to happen in the future. It's sort of worrying and expecting things that are yet to come. So fear is, oh shoot, there's a snake in my room. And anxiety is, what if a snake were to come into my room? So a further way to differentiate between fear and anxiety is to ask the client what they're feeling in their body. You see, when you experience fear, because your body is mobilizing yourself to help protect you from some sort of threat, you usually have this abrupt sensation of your heart rate increasing. You also have an alteration of breathing. Your digestive system stops working so that you can use energy to fight off or to flee away from whatever is threatening you. And even your pupils dilate, meaning that your eyes get a bit better at seeing and surveying what is actually causing the danger. This is the sort of reaction you'll have when you encounter anything that you're afraid of, whether it be heights, snakes, spiders, etc. Now, the response in the body of someone who usually feels anxious is not as abrupt. It's not just a sudden surge in heart rate and the sudden dilation of the pupils. It's a bit more chronic. So someone who feels anxious chronically feels tense in their body. Their muscles are sort of always a bit tight. Usually they have pain in their neck and their shoulders. And so whereas fear is this abrupt and high intensity feeling, anxiety is usually a bit low intensity, but sort of always there. Okay, so that's how you separate fear from anxiety. But what happens if you have a fear response when there's no immediate danger? Well, in psychology, we call that a panic attack. A panic attack is just a sudden burst of fear, and you start to feel these symptoms in your body that are very similar as though there was some sort of threat in the environment, except for the fact that it's difficult to pin down where this feeling is coming from, so it can be quite distressing. Okay, so that's a bit of how you would separate fear and panic from anxiety, and just take some time to think about that for a bit in your specific situation. And at this stage, once the client and I have realized that, okay, it's probably anxiety and not fear or panic that you're dealing with, I would then ask them how their anxiety manifests in terms of behaviors, in terms of their body, and in terms of thoughts. So the reason I would ask this is because those are the three domains in which we can address the anxiety. We can tackle their behaviors, we can tackle their bodily symptoms, or we can tackle the worrying inside their head. So before I give you some practical therapeutic strategies to deal with each of these domains, just pause this video and think about for yourself which domain is most dominant for you. Okay, and so once you've done that, let's start with how I would treat a client in terms of the worry box. So for a lot of people, anxiety can manifest in constant worries. Did I switch the stove off? Am I going to get a promotion at work? Will things work out in my relationship? So it's their brain constantly trying to anticipate some sort of negative consequence and account for that. Now, one way in which you could deal with this box therapeutically is using something called metacognitive therapy. Meta means above and cognitive just means you're thinking. And so metacognitive therapy looks at your thinking from above, not immersed in it. So we start to think about your thinking. And there are two practical strategies from metacognitive therapy that can help you deal with worry. The first strategy involves questioning whether you think worrying is a bad thing. Because for a lot of people, it's not just that they're worrying and that the worry causes distress directly, it's also that they're worried about their worrying. They feel anxious about the fact that they're worrying, or they think that it's bad, or they think that they're weak, or they think that their worry can harm them. So if you form part of this box, just start to think about your beliefs about worrying. And when you begin to do that, see if you can intentionally allow some space for worrying, and that you can make it okay for these worrying thoughts to arise, because the thoughts themselves can't harm you. So almost become a vessel that's strong enough to hold these worries without feeling that there's anything wrong or weak about the fact that you do worry, and you'll have half the distress to deal with. Okay, and so the second strategy from metacognitive therapy is thinking about whether you believe your worry helps you. You see, it might feel a bit counterintuitive, but worrying is actually a way of coping. Lots of people worry so that they don't have to deal with an actual emotion that's sitting with them. In brain studies, we see that people who worry and have generalized anxiety tend to have lots of activation in their left frontal lobe, which is the linguistic side. So they put all of their thinking into little thoughts, little bits of strings of language that's going through their minds constantly. And they have underactivation in the right frontal lobe. And the right hemisphere is a bit more image-based and emotion-based. And so what that tells us is that they're avoiding some sort of imagery or some sort of actual concern and actual emotion by worrying. Worrying almost keeps that at bay, because somewhere at the back of their mind, they believe that if they worry about it, nothing bad will happen. And so you see, metacognitive therapy helps the client realize that, so that they can see that there's some sort of benefit they're getting from worry, because the benefit is usually the grease on the wheels. It's what keeps the wheel of worry turning. And so once you realize that worrying itself won't necessarily help you in your actual life, you start to let go of it a bit more, and it becomes a bit easier to let go of it intentionally. So that was the first box. That's how you deal with your anxiety in terms of how it manifests in your mind, in your thinking. The second way I would help a client who has some sort of generalized anxiety is to question how the anxiety is spilling into their behavior. Because oftentimes the anxiety is not actually the problem itself, but rather the fact that the anxiety leads to certain behaviors. Perhaps the anxiety causes them to just stay at home. Perhaps the anxiety stops them from going out with friends. Perhaps the anxiety gets in the way of them concentrating and studying, or whatever else really. So if the behaviors were primarily the problem, and think about this for yourself a bit, if the behaviors in your life are being dictated by the anxiety, the best thing to probably do is to use some acceptance strategies to be able to sit with the anxiety without acting. And to help you do this, something like mindfulness meditation is really powerful. I won't go too much into mindfulness meditation here. I do have an online course that I'm developing where I'll go a bit more deeply into these topics. But if you don't know what mindfulness meditation is, just YouTube it and you'll find some guided meditations that help you get in touch with the sensations in your body, that help you get in touch with your thoughts and your emotions, so that you can put a bit of gap between what you're feeling and how you act. Because most people act on a whim, even if they don't realize it. There's some sort of thought or emotion they're avoiding, and so they act to keep avoiding that, and then their behaviors don't always work out as they planned, or they don't always fit into the bigger picture of their goals and ambitions. And so I've found mindfulness meditation to be quite a powerful strategy to use with my clients, just so that they realize that they can hold these anxious feelings without necessarily behaving in ways that are actually bad for them in the long run, and that make the anxiety bigger, not smaller, in the long run. And then finally, the last box that you can address in terms of anxiety is what's happening in the body. Because you see, the body is the storehouse for lots of anxious feelings. And people who usually have some sort of generalized anxiety, they can be really distressed by the things they feel in their body. They can be distressed by the tension in their muscles. They can be distressed by feelings in their tummy when they feel really anxious or nervous. And what then usually happens is that their anxiety becomes something to feel anxious about. And so when they feel anxious, they get these symptoms in their body, and then their body tells them, yes, you are in fact anxious, and then they feel more anxious. and so they snowball into more anxiety. So it's helpful to address what's going on in the body so that we can put a pause in that process, and so that they don't snowball into more anxiety, and so that they can get themselves out of this vicious sort of feedback loop. And the strategy that I would use with the client at this stage, if we're addressing these bodily symptoms, is something called progressive muscle relaxation. Progressive muscle relaxation was developed by a clinician called Jacobson. And what happens with PMR is that you slowly work through your body, tensing a specific part of your body. Let's say you start with your arms. You would tense your hands and your arms for a few seconds as hard as you could, and then you would let go of the tension. And then while you're being tensed, you would feel what that feels like in your body. And then when you release the tension, you would feel what that feels like to let go. You see, this gets the person who feels anxious out of the habit of holding their body tightly and tensely. They become a bit more aware of what's going on in their body. And so eventually in their daily lives, their body won't be as responsive to some sort of anxious feelings. And therefore the biofeedback won't occur, and they won't get themselves stuck in this vicious loop, because their body is suddenly not something to feel anxious about. And so I'm sure you could find something on progressive muscle relaxation online. Just Google that and you'll come across some sort of script or some sort of guided process where someone will help walk you through the progressive muscle relaxation technique, just so that you can deal with your anxiety at a bodily level. Now, you're probably on this video because you do believe you can be your own therapist to some degree, which is what I believe wholeheartedly as well. If you want to take that to the next level, I'll leave a link in the description to a free 30-minute masterclass where I help teach basically the foundations of how you can become your own therapist. It's totally free, it's on my website, link in the description below. If you'd like to take this to the next level, then that's a resource I'm happy to share. Until next time, go ahead and become your own therapist.